A wealthy man dismissed his housekeeper, assuming she was insignificant. What she revealed about herself left him and his entire family in awe. Victor Hamilton adjusted his tie, glancing at his reflection in the window of his penthouse overlooking the bustling New York skyline. The view was a symbol of everything he had worked for: power, prestige, and a life above the chaos of the city streets below. Yet, this morning, as the sunlight streamed through the glass, bathing the room in a warm glow, his thoughts were anything but serene. Something about the house felt off. At the far end of the sprawling dining room, Rosa moved efficiently, setting the table for breakfast. She was as she had always been: quiet, unobtrusive, her movements deliberate and precise. Rosa had been with the Hamilton family for 2 decades, her presence as much a part of the household as the fine art hanging on the walls. Her small frame, streaked gray hair neatly tied back, and steady hands conveyed reliability, an anchor in Victor's otherwise turbulent, fast-paced life. Today, however, Victor wasn't in the mood for patience. He watched her arrange the silverware with care, his irritation building as he noticed her hesitation. "Rosa," Victor said sharply, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. She turned, her dark eyes meeting his with a mix of surprise and concern. "Yes, Mr. Hamilton?" He set down his coffee cup with a deliberate thud, the rich, bitter aroma rising between them. "The vase in the study. It's still missing. Why hasn't it been replaced?" Rosa blinked, clearly caught off guard. I'm sorry, Mr. Hamilton. I've been meaning to what? Ignore it?" Victor snapped, standing abruptly. "That vase was a rare piece, Rosa. Irreplaceable. It's been weeks, and you haven't even bothered to inform me of the damage." Her shoulders straightened, though the tremble in her hands betrayed her unease. "It was an accident, sir," she said quietly. "I intended to let you know, but things have been busy." "Busy?" Victor's voice rose, his irritation bubbling over. "This is your job, Rosa. If you can't handle it, perhaps it's time we reconsider your place here." Rosa's lips pressed into a thin line, the faintest hint of defiance flashing in her eyes before she looked away. Victor, accustomed to obedience, didn't miss the subtle shift in her demeanor. She took a moment, as if weighing her response, before finally speaking. "I've served your family for a long time, Mr. Hamilton," she said evenly, though her voice carried an edge he hadn't heard before. "If that's how you feel, then perhaps you're right." Her calmness only fueled Victor's frustration. "It's not personal, Rosa, but this is my home, and I have standards. You've become careless, useless." The word landed like a stone, heavy and unforgiving. Rosa flinched, but only for a second. She set down the tray she had been holding and removed the crisp white apron tied around her waist. As she folded it with deliberate care, Victor felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Regret? No, it couldn't be. Rosa turned to face him one last time, her hands clasped in front of her. "One day, Mr. Hamilton," she said softly, her voice steady and deliberate, "you'll understand that this house holds more than your wealth. And when you do, you'll wish you had listened." Victor frowned, taken aback by her cryptic words, but before he could respond, she walked away, her footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. The heavy silence that followed was almost deafening. For the rest of the morning, Victor went about his day as usual, though Rosa's words lingered like an unwanted guest. He told himself he had made the right decision. Rosa was no longer fit for the job. Yet, as the hours stretched on, the absence of her presence became increasingly noticeable. By lunchtime, the penthouse felt unsettlingly quiet. The polished floors, spotless furniture, and glimmering chandeliers seemed almost sterile without the hum of activity Rosa's daily routine had provided. Victor tried to push the thought aside, but his irritation grew. That evening, as the city lights flickered to life outside his window, Victor poured himself a glass of scotch and settled into his favorite leather armchair. He leaned back, staring at the skyline, trying to shake the unease that had crept into his mind. Rosa's words echoed once more. "This house holds more than your wealth." What had she meant? Victor prided himself on knowing everything about his life and his legacy. The Hamilton family had built their empire on discipline and control, two things he valued above all else. There were no hidden skeletons, no secrets to uncover. Rosa's comment was nothing more than the bitter farewell of a dismissed employee. And yet, Victor found himself wandering through the penthouse, his footsteps slow and aimless. His gaze fell on the study, the room where the missing vase had once stood. The mahogany pedestal now stood bare, its absence almost accusatory. Something about the room felt different tonight. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shelves lined with leather-bound books, the antique clock ticking softly on the mantel. On the desk, a faint glimmer caught his eye, a folded piece of paper, neatly placed as if waiting for him. Victor's curiosity piqued as he unfolded the note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant but firm. You think you know the story of your family, but you've only seen the surface. Look deeper, Mr. Hamilton. The truth is closer than you think. His chest tightened as he read the words again. The note wasn't signed, but its implications were clear. Victor's eyes narrowed, and his mind raced. Could Rosa have left this? Was it part of some petty attempt to unsettle him? Or was there something more? Something he had overlooked? Shaking his head, Victor crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash. He refused to entertain the idea. Whatever Rosa had meant, it was irrelevant. This was his house, his family, and his legacy. He wouldn't allow the ramblings of a disgruntled housekeeper to shake him. Still, as Victor climbed into bed that night, the quiet hum of the penthouse seemed louder than usual. The familiar comfort of his surroundings felt distant, replaced by an unfamiliar weight pressing against his chest. For the first time in years, Victor Hamilton found himself unable to sleep, not because of his work or his ambitions, but because of the nagging feeling that Rosa's parting words might not have been idle. Pause for a moment. What would you do if you were in Victor's shoes? Do you think he made the right decision? Or is there more he should have considered? Share your thoughts in the comments, give this story a rating so far, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to see how the story unfolds. Victor awoke to the muted sounds of the city far below, a subtle hum that never quite reached the heights of his penthouse. The morning light cut across his bedroom like a blade, illuminating the sleek, minimalist decor. Yet, for all the luxury surrounding him, he felt uneasy, a strange weight in his chest that had lingered since the night before. As he dressed, pulling on his tailored suit and securing his watch with practiced efficiency, his thoughts wandered to Rosa's cryptic words. This house holds more than your wealth. It was an absurd statement, wasn't it? A ploy to unsettle him after her dismissal. And yet, as much as Victor tried to brush it off, the words clung to him, gnawing at the edges of his carefully maintained composure. He strode into the kitchen, where the absence of Rosa was starkly evident. The counters were clean but lacked the precision and care she always infused into her work. The coffee pot, though functional, was empty. It was such a small thing, easily remedied, but it grated on him nonetheless. Victor brewed his own coffee, the act unfamiliar and irritating. He tried to push Rosa out of his mind as he sat at the table, sipping the bitter liquid and scrolling through emails on his tablet. A series of acquisitions awaited his approval, but his focus wavered. His gaze kept drifting toward the study down the hall. By mid-morning, the feeling was too much to ignore. Victor entered the study, the room unusually still. He paused near the empty pedestal, where the shattered vase had once stood, a symbol of Rosa's supposed carelessness. Yet, standing there now, Victor realized something he hadn't noticed before. The pedestal wasn't completely empty. A faint discoloration marred the wood near its base, a small stain he couldn't recall seeing before. Victor crouched, running his fingers over the spot. It was smooth but distinct, as though something had once been affixed there. The realization was faintly unsettling. He couldn't imagine Rosa allowing such an imperfection to go unnoticed for long. Returning to his feet, he moved to the bookshelves, a towering collection of leather-bound tomes and old ledgers. These shelves had always been a decorative flourish, more aesthetic than functional. His father had insisted on them, though Victor couldn't remember ever seeing the man so much as open one. Victor's fingers brushed the spines, pausing on a particularly worn volume titled Legacy of Trust. He pulled it free, expecting the usual collection of dry pages, but the book was oddly light. When he opened it, a thick envelope slid out, landing on the desk with a dull thud. Curiosity flared as Victor opened the envelope, revealing a stack of faded photographs and a handwritten letter. His breath caught as he studied the first photograph. It was a black and white image of his parents, younger and smiling, something he rarely remembered seeing. But it was the woman standing beside them that drew his attention. She was unfamiliar, her features partially obscured, but her presence felt oddly significant. The letter was addressed in his father's handwriting, but as Victor scanned the opening lines, it became clear that it wasn't intended for him. "Dearest Rosa, you have been the cornerstone of our family for so many years. Your loyalty and discretion have been invaluable. There are truths I can never share with my son, but you understand what must be done. The weight of our choices may one day catch up to us, but until then, I trust you to guard these secrets as you always have." Victor's hand tightened on the page. His father's words were measured, deliberate. Secrets? What secrets could possibly require Rosa's involvement? He flipped through the photographs, finding more images of the same woman, often with his father. In one, they stood close, the intimacy unmistakable. A dull ache began to form in Victor's temples. He had always considered himself a man of reason, someone who knew the intricacies of his family's legacy. But this was something entirely unexpected. The doorbell rang, snapping Victor from his thoughts. He left the study, the letter still in hand, and crossed to the foyer. On the other side of the door stood a young woman, her dark eyes blazing with a mixture of determination and barely contained anger. "Mr. Hamilton," she said, her voice firm. "I'm Maria, Rosa's daughter." Victor blinked, his mind struggling to connect the presence of this stranger with the revelation he'd just uncovered. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone more curt than he intended. Maria stepped forward, undeterred. "My mother told me to give you this." She held out a second envelope, this one sealed with wax. "She said you'd need it." Victor hesitated before taking it, his brow furrowed. "What is this about?" he demanded. Maria's expression softened, but only slightly. "You dismissed her like she was nothing," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made Victor flinch. "But my mother has given everything to this family, more than you'll ever understand. She wanted me to remind you of that." With that, Maria turned and walked away, leaving Victor standing in the doorway with the envelope clutched in his hand. He shut the door, leaning against it as his mind raced. In the span of a single day, his carefully constructed world had begun to fray at the edges. Back in the study, Victor opened the new envelope with a mixture of apprehension and intrigue. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting unmistakably Rosa's. "Victor, there is much you do not know about your parents, about their choices, and the weight of their decisions. I hope you find the answers you seek, though I doubt they will bring you peace. Begin with the Hamilton archives. There are records your father never intended you to see. But beware. Once you uncover the truth, you may wish you had left it buried." Victor set the letter down, his pulse quickening. The Hamilton archives were housed in the basement vault, a collection of ledgers, contracts, and private correspondence spanning generations. He hadn't thought about them in years, hadn't needed to. His father had always been meticulous about preserving their legacy, but he had never encouraged Victor to delve too deeply. Victor stood, the letter still in his hand, and stared out at the city skyline. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answers waiting for him. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was already beginning to grow. The silence of the penthouse was punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of Victor's leather shoes against the marble floor. He paced the study, his thoughts swirling like a storm cloud. The photograph and letters sat in a neat pile on the desk, yet they might as well have been shouting accusations at him. His father's words to Rosa echoed in his mind. "There are truths I can never share with my son." Victor had always believed in control, in knowing every piece of his carefully curated life. The notion that there were hidden facets to his family's legacy, secrets buried beneath years of polished perfection, unsettled him deeply. He stared at the papers once more, as if sheer force of will might extract answers from them. The sharp chime of the doorbell cut through the quiet, startling him from his thoughts. Victor frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midday. Whoever it was, they had picked an inconvenient time. Reluctantly, Victor left the study and crossed the penthouse. He pulled open the heavy oak door, his brow furrowing at the sight before him. A young woman stood there, her posture straight and unyielding. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long black hair tied into a braid and eyes that mirrored Rose's in their dark intensity. "Yes?" Victor said, his voice crisp, almost impatient. The woman didn't flinch. "Mr. Hamilton," she said, her tone firm and measured. "My name is Maria. I'm Rose's daughter." Victor blinked, taken aback. Rose's daughter? The words sounded foreign on his tongue. Rosa had never mentioned a daughter. Then again, Rosa had rarely spoken of herself at all. Maria nodded, stepping forward slightly. "My mother told me to come here. She said you might need some guidance." She held out an envelope, sealed with red wax. "She left this for you." Victor stared at the envelope, but didn't reach for it immediately. "Why didn't she deliver it herself?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Maria's expression hardened. "You dismissed her," she said bluntly. "She's not coming back. But she wanted you to have this." Victor hesitated, his jaw tightening. Finally, he took the envelope, the wax seal cool against his fingers. "What's in it?" he asked, though he doubted Maria would tell him. "Answers," she said simply. Her gaze didn't waver. "But you won't like them." Victor's lips pressed into a thin line. He considered shutting the door, dismissing her as easily as he had her mother, but something about her presence held him in place. Maria exuded a quiet strength that reminded him of Rosa. She was unshakable, like a storm waiting to be unleashed. "I don't have time for cryptic warnings," Victor said finally. "If your mother had something to say, she could have said it before she left." Maria crossed her arms, her posture defiant. "She tried. You didn't listen. That's why I'm here." Victor opened his mouth to retort, but stopped himself. He was unused to being challenged, especially in his own home. Yet Maria's words stung in a way he couldn't ignore. "Fine," he said curtly. "You've delivered your message. If there's nothing else, there is," Maria interrupted. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "My mother wanted me to remind you of one thing. The truth doesn't care about your wealth or your control. It exists whether you acknowledge it or not." Victor stared at her, his pulse quickening. Before he could respond, Maria turned and walked away, her steps steady and deliberate. He watched her disappear down the hallway, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. Closing the door, Victor returned to the study, his mind racing. He placed the envelope on the desk beside the other letters, staring at it as if it might burst into flames. After a long moment, he broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. The note was written in Rose's precise handwriting. "Victor, I doubt you'll heed my warnings, but I must try. The truth about your family is not as clean as you've been led to believe. Your father made choices that shaped this empire, but they came at a cost, one you've never had to bear. If you wish to understand, you must look where no one else has. Start with the archives in the vault, but tread carefully. The answers may not be what you want to find." Victor's grip on the note tightened. His father's choices? The archives? He had avoided those dusty ledgers and files for years, trusting that whatever was in them wasn't his concern. But Rose's words gnawed at him, feeding a curiosity he couldn't suppress. With a resigned sigh, Victor made his way to the elevator that led to the basement vault. The penthouse had been designed with security in mind, and the vault was no exception. A biometric scanner and key code stood between him and the archives. He placed his hand on the scanner, and the metal door slid open with a hiss. The air inside was cool and stale, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the rows of shelves. Victor hesitated at the threshold, a faint unease prickling at his skin. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the neatly labeled boxes and binders. This was his family's legacy, meticulously cataloged and preserved. He pulled a box labeled Hamilton Financials, 1987 to 1995 from the shelf, and placed it on the table in the center of the room. As he sifted through the documents, He found the usual fare: contracts, balance sheets, correspondence. But then, tucked beneath a stack of letters, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a photograph, old, slightly faded, but unmistakable. His father stood with the same woman from the photographs he had found earlier, their smiles intimate and warm. In the corner of the frame was a date: April 14th, 1990. Victor stared at the image, his mind racing. His parents' marriage had always seemed distant, more of a partnership than a union. But this suggested something else entirely. Beneath the photograph was a letter addressed to Rosa in his father's handwriting. Victor unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the page. "Rosa, I know this is not what you signed up for, but I must ask you once more to protect this family. What happened must remain between us. If Victor ever learns the truth, it could destroy everything we've built. I trust you to keep this safe." Victor's hands trembled as he set the letter down. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they painted was far from clear. One thing was certain: his father had secrets, and Rosa had been the keeper of them. Victor leaned back in the chair, his mind a whirlwind of questions. What had his father done? What truth had Rosa been guarding all these years? And why had she chosen now to reveal it? For the first time in his life, Victor felt as though the foundation of his world had shifted. The truth was out there, waiting for him to uncover it. But as he sat alone in the dimly lit vault, he couldn't shake the feeling that once he found it, there would be no turning back. Victor returned to the penthouse with the weight of the discoveries from the vault pressing heavily on his shoulders. The photograph, the letters, and the faint hints of betrayal swirled in his mind, each revelation adding another layer to the puzzle he hadn't even realized he was piecing together. His father's words in the letter to Rosa echoed relentlessly. "What happened must remain between us." He poured himself a drink, neat whiskey, the burn sharp against his throat, as he settled into the leather armchair in the study. The city lights blinked through the window, indifferent to the turmoil unraveling in his perfectly ordered life. The photograph sat on the desk in front of him, the woman's face now more familiar than it had been just hours ago. He had spent years building his empire, ensuring that nothing slipped past his control. Yet here he was, blindsided by his own family's secrets. Victor's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. The name on the screen was one he hadn't expected to see: Maria. After a brief hesitation, he picked up. "Mr. Hamilton," Maria's voice came through steady, though there was a faint tension behind it. "I assume you've started finding what my mother wanted you to." Victor leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "I found fragments. Enough to know your mother knew far more about my family than I ever realized. But not enough to understand why she's involved." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Maria spoke again, her tone was sharper. "You still don't get it, do you? My mother wasn't just your housekeeper, Mr. Hamilton. She was part of your family's mess, dragged into it because of your father's choices. Choices that hurt a lot of people." Victor frowned, his grip on the phone tightening. "If you know so much, then tell me. Stop speaking in riddles." "I'm not the one you need to hear this from," Maria replied. "There's more to find, and you're close. But when you figure it out, remember this. My mother stayed silent because she cared about your family, even when she had every reason not to." Before Victor could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone in his hand, frustration and unease bubbling beneath his carefully maintained facade. Maria's cryptic warnings had only deepened the mystery, and Victor was no closer to understanding the full picture. Setting the phone aside, he turned his attention back to the photograph. His fingers traced the edges of the faded image, his mind racing. The woman in the picture, her presence seemed to thread through everything he had uncovered so far. Yet, she remained nameless, her connection to the Hamilton family shrouded in ambiguity. Victor rose abruptly, his movements sharp and deliberate. He returned to the study's bookshelves, pulling volumes and rifling through their contents with growing urgency. Contracts, property deeds, correspondence. Nothing seemed to hold the answers he sought. Then, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed financial records, he found a slim leather-bound journal. The initials JH were embossed on the cover in gold. He opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age. The handwriting was unmistakably his father's. Neat, calculated, every word deliberate. Flipping through the entries, Victor's eyes caught on a passage that made his breath hitch. April 17, 1990. Rosa has agreed to keep things quiet, though I can see the strain it puts on her. She doesn't deserve to bear the burden of my mistakes, but she understands what's at stake. The boy is too young to understand, and I intend to keep it that way. The less he knows, the better. Victor read the passage again, his mind racing. The boy. Could his father have been referring to him? And what mistakes had required Rosa's silence? His grip on the journal tightened as he turned the pages, searching for more. Several entries detailed business deals, the expansion of the Hamilton Empire, and the occasional personal reflection. But the references to Rosa, and to the woman in the photograph, were sporadic, almost as though his father had deliberately avoided writing too much. One final entry caught Victor's eye. May 3, 1991. I've done what I can to protect Victor from the consequences of my actions, but the truth remains a threat. Rosa is the only one who knows everything. She has sacrificed so much for this family, and I owe her a debt I can never repay. If the truth ever comes to light, I fear it will destroy him. Victor slammed the journal shut, his chest tight. The more he uncovered, the less he felt he knew. His father's words painted a picture of a man torn between guilt and duty, a man who had entrusted Rosa with something too dangerous to reveal. But what was it? What could be so devastating that even now, years later, Rosa had chosen to remain silent? Determined to find answers, Victor retrieved the documents he had brought up from the vault. He spread them out across the desk, poring over every page with meticulous care. Patterns began to emerge, names, dates, financial transactions that didn't align with the pristine image his father had always projected. The woman in the photographs appeared again and again, her presence woven through business meetings, travel records, and personal correspondence. One name stood out: Margaret Riley. The woman in the photograph finally had a name, but her connection to the Hamilton family remained unclear. Victor's frustration mounted as he sifted through the evidence, the pieces refusing to fit together. It wasn't until he stumbled upon an old deed for a property in upstate New York that a glimmer of clarity emerged. The property, listed under Margaret Riley's name, had been purchased by the Hamilton Family Trust in 1989. A note in the margin caught Victor's attention: transfer for caretaking, Rosa to oversee. Victor sat back, the realization hitting him like a freight train. Rosa hadn't just been a housekeeper. She had been a gatekeeper, entrusted with something or someone his father had deemed too important to leave to chance. The weight of the discovery settled heavily on Victor's shoulders. The picture was still incomplete, but one thing was clear. His father's legacy was far more complicated than he had ever imagined, and Rosa, far from being useless, had been at the center of it all. As the night deepened, Victor leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his hands steepled beneath his chin. The truth was close, tantalizingly within reach. But with each step closer, the stakes seemed to rise. Whatever secrets his father had buried, they were powerful enough to shake the foundation of everything Victor thought he knew. And for the first time, he wondered if he was prepared to face them. The next morning, Victor rose early, his mind still tangled in the web of discoveries he'd uncovered the night before. The leather-bound journal, the deed, the cryptic letters, all of it pointed toward Rosa being far more entwined in the Hamilton family's history than he had ever imagined. Her quiet demeanor, her unwavering presence in his life. He'd always dismissed her as a background figure, but now he saw the truth. Rosa had been a silent pillar, holding together the cracks in a foundation he hadn't even known was fragile. As he paced the penthouse, the morning sunlight streaking across the marble floors, his phone buzzed again. He picked it up, half expecting Maria, but the number was unfamiliar. "Mr. Hamilton?" A gruff male voice greeted him when he answered. "My name is Michael Riley. I believe you've come across my sister's name." "Margaret Riley?" Victor froze. The name Margaret Riley had been haunting him since he'd uncovered the photograph, yet here was someone connected to her, calling him out of the blue. "How did you get this number?" Victor demanded, his tone sharp. Michael chuckled, the sound bitter. "You're not as unreachable as you think. And before you ask, Rosa gave it to me. She said you'd need to talk to me. Victor's grip on the phone tightened. Why would Rosa involve you? Because she thought it was time you learned the truth, Michael said bluntly. I'm in town. If you're serious about understanding what your father did and why Rosa protected those secrets, you'll meet me. There's a coffee shop on 6th and Lexington. Noon. The line went dead before Victor could respond. He stared at the phone, a swirl of emotions tightening his chest. The prospect of answers both thrilled and terrified him. He was used to controlling the narrative, but now it felt like the narrative was controlling him. The coffee shop was unassuming, its modest decor a far cry from the opulence Victor was accustomed to. He arrived precisely at noon, his tailored suit setting him apart from the casually dressed patrons. Michael was already there, seated at a corner table. He was a rugged man in his late 40s, his weathered features and piercing green eyes a testament to a life less sheltered than Victor's. You're punctual, Michael said as Victor approached, gesturing to the seat opposite him. Good. That means you're serious. Victor sat down, his gaze steady. Let's not waste time. Who was Margaret Riley, and what does she have to do with my family? Michael leaned back in his chair, studying Victor for a moment before speaking. Margaret was my sister, he began, his voice calm but firm. She was also your father's mistress. Victor stiffened, the words hitting him like a blow. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a jolt through him. My father had an affair, he said flatly, his mind racing. And Rosa knew? Michael nodded. She didn't just know. She was the one who helped keep it quiet. Your father entrusted her with everything. Margaret didn't want to expose him or ruin your family's reputation. But things got complicated. Victor leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. What kind of complications? Michael's expression darkened. Margaret got pregnant. The words landed like a thunderclap, and for a moment, Victor couldn't breathe. He stared at Michael, his mind struggling to process the revelation. His father had another child? A sibling he had never known about? She wanted to keep the baby, Michael continued, his voice heavy with emotion. But your father, he panicked. He was terrified of what it would mean for his empire, for his family's pristine image. Rosa was the one who convinced Margaret to leave, to move upstate, away from the public eye. The Hamilton Family Trust bought her a house, paid for her expenses, and Rosa made sure she was taken care of. Victor sat back, his head spinning. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but the picture they painted was one of betrayal, fear, and manipulation. What happened to the baby? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening. The baby didn't survive. Complications during the birth. Margaret was devastated. She blamed your father for the stress, the isolation, everything. Victor's chest ached as the weight of the story pressed down on him. And Rosa? Why would she stay with my family after all that? Michael's expression softened, though his eyes still burned with intensity. Because Rosa understood loyalty in a way most people don't. She stayed for you. For me. Victor frowned. Michael nodded. She knew the truth would destroy you. She didn't want you to carry the weight of your father's choices. Rosa believed you could be better than him, that you could build something different, something good. So she stayed, kept the secrets, and made sure you had the chance to live your life without that shadow hanging over you. Victor was silent, the enormity of Rosa's sacrifice sinking in. He had dismissed her, belittled her, called her useless, all while she had been protecting him from the sins of his father. Michael leaned forward, his voice low but firm. You've spent your life chasing power, control, and wealth. But let me ask you this, Mr. Hamilton. What will you do with the truth now that you know it? Victor didn't have an answer. He left the coffee shop in a daze, the city's noise and bustle a distant hum as he walked aimlessly through the streets. Rosa's calm, steady presence filled his mind, and for the first time, he saw her for what she truly was. A guardian, a protector, someone who had borne the brunt of his family's darkest secrets so he wouldn't have to. When he returned to the penthouse, the emptiness felt overwhelming. He stood in the study, staring at the pile of documents and photographs on the desk. The man he had idolized, his father, the architect of the Hamilton Empire, was now a stranger to him, and Rosa, the woman he had dismissed so easily, had been the one holding everything together. Victor sank into his chair, his hands covering his face. He didn't know where to go from here, but one thing was certain. Rosa deserved more than an apology. She deserved recognition, gratitude, and perhaps most of all, justice. As the evening deepened and the city lights flickered to life, Victor made a decision. He would find Rosa, no matter how long it took, and when he did, he would give her the acknowledgement she had been denied for so long. Victor sat in the dim light of his study, the weight of his father's choices and Rosa's sacrifices bearing down on him. His thoughts churned with questions that refused to quiet. The journal, the photographs, and Michael's revelations had all pointed to one conclusion. His family's legacy was built on secrets and lies. But the full truth still felt just out of reach, like a distant figure obscured by fog. Driven by equal parts desperation and determination, Victor decided to follow Rosa's final instruction, to delve deeper into the Hamilton archives. Somewhere within the meticulously organized files lay the missing pieces of a story that had eluded him his entire life. Descending into the vault felt different this time. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive, as if the room itself were guarding the secrets he sought. He began rifling through boxes with renewed urgency, pulling out ledgers, property deeds, and financial records. Hours passed, and his frustration grew. There was nothing that illuminated the full scope of what his father had done. And then he found it. It was a small, nondescript box, its edges worn with age. Tucked beneath stacks of old tax records, it seemed entirely out of place among the otherwise pristine archives. Victor pulled it out, the faint smell of aged wood and dust rising as he lifted the lid. Inside was an intricately carved music box. The wood was smooth and dark, its surface adorned with delicate floral engravings. Victor recognized it immediately. His mother's prized possession, a family heirloom she had treasured but kept locked away in her later years. He had assumed it had been lost or discarded after her death. He wound the key on the side and opened the lid. A soft, melancholic melody filled the room, the haunting tune tugging at something deep within him. But it wasn't the music that caught his attention. It was what lay inside. Beneath the velvet lining was a hidden compartment, cleverly concealed. Victor pressed gently on one corner, and the false bottom popped open with a soft click. Inside was a folded letter and a small, worn photograph. Victor's breath caught as he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was his mother's, elegant and precise, though the ink had faded with time. His heart pounded as he began to read. "To my son, if you are reading this, it means the truth has found its way to you, as I always feared it would. I write this not to seek forgiveness, but to offer you an understanding of the choices that shaped our lives. Your father was a man of great ambition, but with that ambition came sacrifices. Sacrifices I was complicit in, though it pains me to admit it." Victor's grip tightened on the paper as he continued. "Margaret Riley was more than a fleeting indiscretion. She was a woman your father loved deeply, though he would never admit it to himself or to me. When she became pregnant, the weight of our reputation bore down on us. I convinced your father to send her away, to protect what we had built. It was a selfish act, one that haunts me to this day." The words blurred as Victor's eyes burned with unshed tears. His mother's tone was raw, unfiltered, a stark contrast to the polished image she had always presented to the world. "Rosa was the only one who stood against us. She saw Margaret's pain and begged us to do right by her. But we were too proud, too blinded by our own fears to listen. When Margaret lost the baby, I saw part of Rosa die as well. She blamed us, rightfully so, but she stayed, for reasons I still cannot comprehend. Perhaps she believed she could save you from becoming like us. Perhaps she simply had nowhere else to go." Victor set the letter down, his hands trembling. The image of his mother, the poised, distant woman who had ruled their household with an iron will, shattered in his mind. She had been complicit in his father's betrayal, her actions driven by fear and pride. He picked up the photograph. It was of Margaret again, but this time she was alone, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She stared into the camera with a soft, almost wistful expression. The date in the corner read June 1990, mere months before everything had unraveled. Victor sat back, his chest tight. The music box continued to play its mournful tune, each note winding deeper into his soul. He realized now that Rosa had been more than just a housekeeper. She had been a witness to his family's darkest moments, a silent guardian who had endured unimaginable pain for the sake of a family that had wronged her. His thoughts drifted back to her parting words. "This house holds more than your wealth." She had been right. The penthouse, the archives, the heirlooms, they were all repositories of a truth Victor had been too blind to see. The following morning, Victor made arrangements to visit the property upstate. The deed he had uncovered listed it as abandoned, but he needed to see it for himself. If Rosa had spent years overseeing it, there had to be more to the story. The drive was long, the city skyline fading into rolling hills and dense forests. When he finally arrived, the house was exactly as he had imagined. A modest, weathered structure surrounded by overgrown gardens. The air was still, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Victor pushed open the creaky front door, stepping into a space that felt frozen in time. The furniture was sparse but carefully arranged, as though someone had once taken great care to make the house a home. On a small table by the window, he found a photograph of Rosa and Margaret, their smiles warm and genuine. It was the first time he had seen Rosa look truly happy. He wandered through the house, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. In the back bedroom, he found a small crib, its paint chipped and faded. The sight of it made his chest ache. This had been meant to be a sanctuary, a place where Margaret could raise her child in peace. Instead, it had become a monument to loss. As he stood there, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had been stolen, Victor felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. His family's wealth and power had come at a cost, one he had never had to pay but that others had borne in silence. Rosa's loyalty, Margaret's sacrifice, the child who had never had a chance. All of it weighed heavily on him. For the first time in his life, Victor Hamilton felt truly humbled, and he knew that when he finally found Rosa, he owed her more than an apology. He owed her the truth she had fought so hard to protect, and the respect she had never been given. The city lights glimmered beyond the glass walls of the penthouse, casting long, jagged shadows across the marble floors. Victor stood at the window, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching the world below. He had been standing there for what felt like hours, his mind consumed by the discoveries of the past few days. The revelations about his father, Margaret, and Rosa had unraveled his once unshakable view of his family's legacy. Now, everything felt fragile, fractured. The sound of the elevator chiming startled him. His brow furrowed. He wasn't expecting anyone. He set the glass down and moved toward the door, his steps cautious. When it slid open, revealing Rosa standing there, Victor froze. "Rosa," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and something he couldn't quite name. Relief, perhaps, or guilt. "What are you doing here?" She stepped into the penthouse, her movements as steady and deliberate as always. There was no hesitation in her demeanor, no indication of the tumultuous emotions Victor had been grappling with since her departure. She carried a small bag over one arm, her neatly pressed coat draped over the other. "I thought it was time we talked," she said simply, her voice calm but firm. "I assume you've been busy uncovering the truth." Victor's jaw tightened. He gestured toward the living room, his heart pounding as he followed her to the couch. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, imagining what he might say if he ever saw her again. But now, faced with her unwavering presence, the words seemed to evade him. "Why now?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. "Why come back?" Rosa lowered herself onto the couch, setting her bag down beside her. She folded her hands in her lap, her dark eyes meeting his with a calm intensity. "Because you're ready," she said. "You weren't before." Victor frowned, sinking into the armchair opposite her. "What makes you so sure I'm ready now?" She tilted her head slightly, the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. "You've started looking. You're asking questions. That's more than you've ever done before." Her words stung, though Victor knew she was right. For years, He had lived with a surface-level understanding of his family, content to bask in the wealth and power they had amassed without questioning how it had been built. Now, those foundations had been shaken, and he was no longer certain of anything. "I know about Margaret," he said, his voice low. "About the baby. About everything you did to protect her." Rosa nodded, her expression unchanged. "Then you know what your father and mother were capable of." Victor leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I can't understand why you stayed," he admitted. "After everything they put you through, everything they made you a part of, why didn't you leave?" Rosa's gaze softened, and for the first time, Victor thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. "I stayed because of you," she said quietly. "You were just a boy. You didn't choose any of this, Victor. You didn't deserve to be punished for their mistakes." Her words struck a chord deep within him, and he felt a lump rise in his throat. "But I dismissed you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I called you useless. After everything you did for this family, that's how I treated you." Rosa's expression didn't change, though her eyes seemed to soften further. "You didn't know," she said simply. "You couldn't have. And if I stayed angry at you for being blind to the truth, I'd have no one left to forgive." Victor ran a hand through his hair, the weight of her forgiveness almost unbearable. "I don't deserve your loyalty," he said. "Not after the way I treated you." Rosa regarded him for a moment, her hands clasped neatly in her lap. "Loyalty isn't about deserving, Victor," she said. "It's about choice. I chose to stay because I believed you could be better than them." Victor looked away, his gaze falling on the photograph he had placed on the coffee table earlier. The image of Margaret, her hands resting protectively on her pregnant belly. "I want to be better," he said after a long pause. "I want to make things right. But I don't even know where to start." Rosa reached out, picking up the photograph. She studied it for a moment before setting it back down. "You start by facing the truth," she said. "All of it. No more running, no more hiding behind the legacy your parents left you." Victor nodded, a new resolve settling over him. "Then tell me," he said. "Tell me everything." For the next hour, Rosa recounted the story in painstaking detail. She spoke of Margaret's relationship with Victor's father, the fear and isolation she had endured after being sent away, and the tragedy of losing the baby she had fought so hard to protect. She described the strain it had placed on Rosa herself, the sleepless nights, the endless guilt, the silent burden of carrying secrets that weren't hers to keep. Victor listened in silence, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. With each revelation, the image of his family that he had clung to for so long crumbled further. By the time Rosa finished, he felt as though he had been hollowed out, every assumption about his past stripped away. "I don't know how you did it," he said finally, his voice raw. "How you stayed. How you didn't let it break you." Rosa's faint smile returned, though it was tinged with sadness. "It did break me, Victor," she said softly, "but I learned how to live with the pieces." Her words hung in the air, and Victor felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost physical. "You shouldn't have had to," he said. "None of this should have fallen on you." Rosa reached out, placing a hand on his. "What's done is done," she said. "The question now is what you're going to do about it." Victor met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. For so long, he had believed that power meant control, that wealth was a shield against the consequences of his family's actions. Now, he understood how hollow those beliefs were. The legacy he had inherited wasn't one of strength. It was one of pain, built on the backs of people like Rosa and Margaret. "I'm going to honor the sacrifices you made," he said finally, his voice firm. "I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way. I won't let this family's legacy end in shame." Rosa nodded, her expression unreadable. "Then maybe there's hope for you yet." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the conversation settling over them like a heavy blanket. For the first time in years, Victor felt as though he could breathe, not freely, but deeply enough to know that change was possible. As the night stretched on, Rosa rose to leave, her movements as steady and deliberate as ever. Victor walked her to the door, the words "thank you" catching in his throat. She paused, turning to him with one final, quiet remark. "Remember, Victor," she said, "the truth doesn't just set you free. It makes you responsible." And with that, she was gone, leaving Victor alone once more. But this time, the emptiness of the penthouse felt different. It wasn't a void. It was a space waiting to be filled with something better. The following morning, Victor awoke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The weight of the previous night's conversation with Rosa hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted into something else: resolve. He had spent years living a life shaped by his family's shadows, but now he was ready to reclaim his own narrative. Victor sat at his desk, staring at the stack of papers and photographs spread before him. Rosa's parting words echoed in his mind. "The truth doesn't just set you free. It makes you responsible." He knew now what he needed to do. It wasn't enough to acknowledge the past. He had to take action, to use the power and resources at his disposal to make amends for the harm his family had caused. The first step was Margaret's property. Victor pulled out the deed and studied it carefully. The house upstate had been left abandoned for years, a monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. It deserved better. Margaret's memory deserved better. Victor made a note to have the property restored, not as a private estate, but as a sanctuary for others in need. A place where women facing difficult circumstances could find shelter and support. His second step was more personal. He knew that Rosa, for all her strength and resilience, had endured too much without recognition or recompense. She had sacrificed her happiness, her well-being, and countless opportunities to protect a family that had taken her for granted. Victor resolved to ensure she never wanted for anything again. He drafted a letter to his legal team, instructing them to establish a trust in Rosa's name, one substantial enough to provide her with security for the rest of her life. But the hardest step was yet to come. Victor stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his tie. Today, he would be confronting the board of Hamilton Industries. For years, he had upheld the pristine image of the company, building on the empire his father had left him. But now, he saw the cracks in that foundation. The power and wealth the company wielded had been amassed at the expense of others, people like Margaret and families like Rosa's. It was time to chart a new course, even if it meant challenging everything the company had stood for. The boardroom was as imposing as ever, its long table surrounded by chairs occupied by some of the most influential figures in the business world. Victor entered the room with his usual commanding presence, though inside, his nerves churned. As he took his seat at the head of the table, a hush fell over the room. "Thank you all for being here," Victor began, his voice steady. "There's something important we need to discuss." The board members exchanged curious glances, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Victor drew a deep breath, his hands resting on the table. For decades, Hamilton Industries has been a symbol of success, innovation, and power, he said. But that success came at a cost that many of us, myself included, have ignored for far too long. One of the senior members, a graying man named James, furrowed his brow. "Victor, what exactly are you suggesting?" Victor met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm suggesting that we acknowledge the harm this company has done. The deals we've made, the people we've left behind, they're not just numbers on a balance sheet. They're lives we've affected, often negatively." A murmur spread through the room, some board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Victor raised a hand, silencing them. "I've spent the last few weeks uncovering the truth about my own family, about the decisions my father made to build this empire. And I've realized something. This company doesn't have to follow the same path. We have the power to be better." Another board member, a sharp-featured woman named Elaine, leaned forward. "And what exactly does better look like?" Victor's lips pressed into a thin line. He had anticipated resistance, but he was prepared. "It starts with transparency," he said. "We audit our practices, identify where we've caused harm, and make reparations where possible. And going forward, we prioritize ethical decision-making, even if it costs us in the short term." The murmurs grew louder, skepticism rippling through the room. James shook his head. "Victor, I admire your intentions, but this is a business. We can't operate on sentiment." "It's not sentiment," Victor countered, his voice firm. "It's responsibility. If we want to build a legacy that lasts, it has to be built on more than profit margins. It has to be built on integrity." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Victor met the gaze of each board member, his resolve unshaken. "I'm not asking for permission," he said. "I'm telling you how we're moving forward. If anyone has an issue with that, they're welcome to step down." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, the board members began to nod, their expressions a mix of grudging respect and cautious optimism. Victor exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. This was just the beginning, but it was a start. Later that evening, Victor sat alone on the balcony of his penthouse, a glass of whiskey in hand. The city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling like a vast constellation. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond power and wealth. He wasn't just carrying on his family's legacy, he was reshaping it. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Rosa standing there, her expression calm but curious. "I heard about the board meeting," she said. Victor smiled faintly, gesturing for her to join him. Word travels fast. Rosa stepped onto the balcony, the cool evening breeze ruffling her neatly pinned hair. "You've made some bold decisions," she said, her tone neutral. "Not everyone would have the courage to do that." Victor looked out at the city, his gaze distant. "It's the least I can do," he said. "For Margaret, for the baby, for you." Rosa studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You've come a long way, Victor," she said. "But remember, redemption isn't a destination. It's a journey." Victor nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I know," he said, "and I'm ready for it." The two of them stood there in silence, the city's hum serving as a quiet backdrop to their shared understanding. For Victor, the road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Not as the man his family had shaped him to be, but as the man he chose to become. Victor Hamilton sat in the dim light of his study, staring at the pile of documents that seemed to breathe with their own ominous weight. The soft hum of the city beyond the towering windows offered little comfort. The more he uncovered about his family, the deeper the fissures ran, threatening to collapse everything he thought he knew. Yet, despite the revelations of the past few days, Victor felt an itch beneath his skin, a gnawing sense that the truth he'd uncovered was incomplete. Rosa's words echoed in his mind. "The truth doesn't just set you free. It makes you responsible." She had chosen her moments carefully, doling out fragments of the past, waiting for Victor to reach the point where he could handle more. But now, he was done waiting. There was something she hadn't told him, something that still hung heavily in the air between them. Determined, he picked up his phone and dialed her number. It was late, but Rosa answered on the second ring, her voice steady and calm. "Victor," she said, as though she had been expecting his call. "I need to see you," he said, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. "I know there's more you haven't told me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that felt weighted with consideration. "You're persistent," she said finally. "Meet me tomorrow morning at Margaret's property. It's time you saw everything." The drive upstate felt different this time. The winding roads and dense forests, which had seemed serene during his previous visit, now felt ominous. Victor gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with questions. What more could there be? The affair, the pregnancy, Margaret's tragic end. He had believed these were the darkest shadows of his family's past. But if Rosa thought there was still more to uncover, then he could only imagine the magnitude of what awaited him. When he arrived at the house, the morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown garden. Rosa was waiting for him on the porch, her posture as calm and steady as ever. She gestured for him to follow her without a word, leading him around the side of the house to a narrow path that disappeared into the woods. Victor's unease grew with each step, the silence between them amplifying the sound of their footsteps on the soft earth. After several minutes, they reached a small clearing. At its center was an unmarked grave, the soil above it soft and slightly sunken. Victor stopped, his breath catching in his throat. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rosa turned to face him, her dark eyes heavy with sorrow. "This," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "is where Margaret's baby is buried." Victor staggered back a step, the weight of her words crashing over him. "The baby? They told me it didn't survive. That it was taken care of." Rosa nodded, her expression unreadable. "It didn't survive. But what they didn't tell you is how much Margaret fought to bury the child here, where she could visit. She couldn't bear the thought of her baby being discarded like an inconvenience." Victor's chest tightened, a mix of anger and grief bubbling to the surface. "They lied to me," he said, his voice shaking. "All these years they lied. They lied to everyone," Rosa said quietly. "Your father, your mother. They were consumed by their fear of scandal. They didn't see Margaret's pain. They didn't care. But I did." Victor sank to his knees, staring at the grave. The weight of his family's choices, their cruelty and selfishness, pressed down on him. "How could they do this?" he whispered. "How could they be so blind?" Rosa placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch steady and grounding. "Power blinds people, Victor," she said. "Your father wasn't a monster, but he was a man who valued his legacy above all else. He made terrible choices because he was afraid of losing what he'd built, afraid of losing control." Victor clenched his fists, the anger inside him sharp and consuming. "And my mother?" he asked. "She knew, didn't she?" Rosa nodded. "She knew. She was the one who convinced your father to send Margaret away. She believed it was for the best, but deep down, I think she always knew it was wrong." Victor's head bowed, the truth of his family's legacy cutting deeper than he had anticipated. He had spent his life idolizing his father, respecting his mother, and believing in the perfection of their empire. Now, that empire felt like a house of cards, built on a foundation of lies. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Finally, Rosa broke the silence. "I stayed," she said softly, "because I couldn't let their mistakes define you. You were just a boy, Victor. You didn't choose any of this." Victor looked up at her, his eyes brimming with tears. "You sacrificed everything for us," he said. "For me." Rosa's gaze didn't waver. "It wasn't a sacrifice," she said. "It was a choice. And I'd make it again." The drive back to the city was a blur. Victor's thoughts swirled with everything Rosa had told him, each revelation adding another layer of weight to his already heavy heart. The unmarked grave, Margaret's pain, Rosa's silent endurance. It was too much. Yet, amid the sorrow, Victor felt a flicker of clarity. He couldn't undo the past, but he could honor the people who had suffered because of his family's actions. Margaret, her child, Rosa, they deserved more than his guilt. They deserved action. When Victor returned to his penthouse, he wasted no time. He picked up the phone and made a series of calls, mobilizing his legal team, his architects, and his board members. He outlined plans to create a foundation in Margaret's name, one dedicated to supporting women and children in crisis. He arranged for the unmarked grave to be properly tended, a memorial erected to ensure Margaret's baby was never forgotten. Finally, he called Rosa. "I wanted you to know," he said, his voice steady, "that I'm taking action. The foundation, the memorial. It's just the beginning. I want to make things right." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Rosa spoke. "You're doing the right thing, Victor," she said. "But remember, redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a better future." Victor nodded, her words settling deeply within him. "Thank you, Rosa," he said, "for everything." As he hung up, Victor felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he had experienced before. The truth had been painful, but it had also been freeing. For the first time, he felt as though he was living not in the shadow of his family's mistakes, but in the light of his own choices. He walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The path ahead was uncertain, but Victor was ready to face it, not as the man his family had shaped him to be, but as the man he was choosing to become. Victor Hamilton stood in the gleaming lobby of Hamilton Industries, the morning sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows and casting long shadows across the marble floor. Today was a significant day, not just for him, but for the legacy of his family. He adjusted his tie, his movements deliberate and calm, though his mind was anything but. Months of introspection, revelation, and rebuilding had led him to this moment. As he rode the elevator to the top floor, Victor's thoughts turned to the people who had shaped his journey. Margaret, a woman he would never meet but whose sacrifice had left an indelible mark on his life. Rosa, the quiet guardian who had been more of a parent to him than he'd ever realized. And the countless others whose stories he would never know but whose lives had been touched, for better or worse, by the Hamilton name. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors slid open to reveal the boardroom. The room was already filled with the company's most influential figures, executives, shareholders, and senior staff, each one murmuring quietly as they waited for Victor to begin. At the head of the long table sat an empty chair, waiting for him. Victor walked to his place with purpose, his gaze sweeping over the room. He could feel their curiosity, their skepticism. They had grown accustomed to his leadership style, sharp, decisive, and relentless in the pursuit of profit. Today, he would show them a different side of himself. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady as he took his seat. "As many of you know, the past few months have been a time of great reflection for me." A murmur rippled through the room, but Victor pressed on. "I've spent my life upholding the Hamilton legacy," he said. "But in doing so, I've overlooked the cost of that legacy. The lives that were affected, the sacrifices that were made, and the harm that was left unacknowledged. Today that changes." Elaine, one of the more vocal board members, leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing. "And how exactly do you intend to address that, Victor?" Victor met her gaze without flinching. "We start by acknowledging the truth," he said. "This company has been built on decisions that prioritize profit over people. It's time to change that. Effective immediately, we will be implementing a new set of ethical guidelines for all operations. Transparency, accountability, and sustainability will be at the core of everything we do." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the table. James, the eldest member of the board, frowned. "Victor, I admire your conviction, but this is a business. We have responsibilities to our shareholders, and we have responsibilities to the people our decisions affect," Victor countered, his tone firm but measured. "This isn't just about profit, it's about legacy. A legacy that isn't defined by wealth alone, but by the impact we leave behind." He let his words hang in the air, watching as the room absorbed his vision. Slowly, heads began to nod, some with reluctance, others with cautious optimism. Victor knew it wouldn't be easy to change the course of a ship this large, but he also knew it was necessary. "Margaret's foundation," Victor continued, his voice softening as he leaned forward, "will be the first step in that change. This initiative will provide support for women and children in crisis, offering them the resources and opportunities they need to rebuild their lives. It will be funded directly by Hamilton Industries, as a testament to our commitment to making things right." For the first time, Victor saw genuine emotion flicker across the faces of those around the table. The weight of his words wasn't lost on them, and the murmurs of approval grew louder. Later that evening, Victor returned to the penthouse, exhaustion mingling with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The day had been long and challenging, but it had also been transformative. The board's approval of his proposals marked a turning point, not just for the company, but for him personally. As he stepped inside, the scent of fresh flowers greeted him. On the coffee table was a bouquet of white lilies and a note in Rose's unmistakable handwriting. He picked it up, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Victor, you've made me proud. Margaret would be proud too. Keep going. You're on the right path." With gratitude, Victor set the note down carefully, his chest tightening with emotion. Rosa's words carried a weight that no boardroom approval could match. She had been the silent force behind his transformation, her quiet strength guiding him toward a better version of himself. He walked to the balcony, the city stretching out before him in a sea of glittering lights. For the first time, those lights didn't feel like symbols of isolation or ambition. They felt like possibilities. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph of Margaret, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. He traced the edges of the picture with his thumb, a silent promise forming in his mind. "I won't let you be forgotten," he murmured, "and I won't waste the chance Rosa gave me." As the night deepened, Victor felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. His journey was far from over, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But he was no longer afraid. He was no longer running from the shadows of his family's past. Instead, he was walking toward the light of a new legacy, one built not on power, but on purpose. For Victor Hamilton, it was a new beginning, and for the first time, he felt ready to embrace it.